A short guide to organizational shading. So what we're up to today is we're going to define organizational shading, and then I'm going to go over some different examples from art history of some of my favorite drawing. And there's so much material that I was able to find on this subject and so many great drawings that I decided to make it a specific discussion of organizational shading rather than rendering, and there's a separate discussion on rendering. So to dive right in, the first image I have up here is just designed to just blow you away. And it's by an artist that, at least in 2020, not a lot of the art world people are going to know who this is. His name is Chris Van Allsburg. He was a children's book artist in the 90s, had a fantastic career, won every award in the industry, and just produced some of the best drawings, I think, of the late 20th century. And that was something I noticed when I was in college in the late 90s or early to mid 90s, is that I was studying drawing illustration at the time, but I wasn't seeing any really good contemporary drawing. Like it wasn't happening, at least not that I could find. And what I learned was that it seemed like all the best drawing was being done in the illustration world, like in children's books. So that was where I spent most of my time. I didn't do a lot of, I didn't pay that much attention to the art history sort of art that I was being shown in school because it just didn't really appeal to me as much. Although when I got more into painting, I found a lot more there that was useful to me. But Chris Van Allsburg was my favorite, and he's just got some unbelievable drawings. And this drawing of this like Titanic sort of boat pushing the Venice Canal open and trying to wedge its way in there. It's just it's got everything. It's got drama, it's got mystery. It makes clear references to MC Escher, who we'll talk about a little bit towards the end of the video. But it's playful and it's terrifying. It's everything that a good drawing should be. And the reason that it works is all based on its values. Now remember, when we start talking about value, we're talking about lights and darks. That's what value refers to. The word tone also refers to lights and darks, but I use value when I'm discussing it. I almost never use the word tone. But this drawing, the way that its values are organized in that organizational shading, that's what we're talking about. The way that the values are organized is the primary mover of what makes this drawing work. And we have a drawing that is 3/4 dark to black, and the lightest light is that top of the boat. The lightest light is surrounded by slightly darker values, so it just glows. And the vast majority of the subject is in the dark. And I actually had a really hard time. That's a very important idea. And I had a really hard time finding images that actually pull that off. Most of the drawings and paintings that you see where they're trying to do this just fail miserably. So I was able to find two that I wanted to share with everybody, but this is one of my favorite drawings of all time, and I'm really glad that I was able to get a good image of it. So the next Van Allsburg picture is, he's just such a technical wizard when it comes to drawing. That's one of the reasons I like to show his work to students, because there's a level of playfulness, but a level of practicality. He's not doing anything really fancy. He just does everything very mechanically sound and his values are just rock solid. And there's a topic of discussion that runs through some of my other videos, and it'll come up here because Van Allsburg's training is actually as a sculptor and not as a drawing, or not as a 2D person, let's say. And there is something special about the way that 3D people approach drawing problems that just elevates them. And the work just tends to be so much better. And that's all I'm going to say about that now, because it's not super relevant, other than these are some of the best drawings that I can find. And they're made by a 3D person and not a 2D person. And we 2D people, there's a little shame involved there that we can't seem to get it together to be better. But the Jumanji drawing here, that's probably his most famous book. Of course, the Polar Express is there too, but the Polar Express is not charcoal or graphite drawings, whereas Jumanji is. And just really wonderful organizational shading in that he builds the space of the room, plants the chimps in it, uses perspective to wrap the space around the chimps, and then uses the girl and her expression to open the space up. It's genius level drawing. The next one is sort of a setup drawing in the book, and it's more of like a playful thing where he just shows the two kids and their sort of enthusiastic play, and it's the game is, or the book is about a board game that goes crazy, and it's a really great book of drawings. Highly recommend owning a copy if you're a drawing enthusiast on any level. But we're going to move to more somber subjects from here, and we have Kathe Kollwitz, and I'm sure I mispronounced her first name, but Kollwitz is pretty easy to pronounce. But she is one of the great draftsmen of the early 20th century. Her work is super dramatic, super emotional. You look at her work and you just want to cry. And she just pushes all your buttons, and it's just very, very rich narratives run through her work. And this is a lithograph. It's not a drawing, but lithographs are drawn, so it counts as far as we're concerned. But what she does with the organizational shading side of things here is she gives us a very, very shallow space. She crams the figure into it, and then by depriving us of foreground space, she sort of pushes our face up against the drawing, like she crowds the viewer with the image. And what's going on is this lady is she's wetting this blade with her tongue so that she can sharpen it and go out and fight in this like peasant revolt that was going on in Germany. I'm not sure when. It may have been pre-World War I. But the World Wars feature prominently in Kollwitz's body of work. And she was primarily a printmaker, so she's got really good graphic strength across everything that she does. And her work is just a marvel. I'm going to feature her more in some other videos because there's so much about her that's worth talking about. Now I'm going to move to Antonio Lopez Garcia, whose work is a lot less emotional and more contemplative. He is a contemporary artist. The work I'm showing you is 20th century. I don't know that anything I'm going to show you is going to be in the last 20 years, but he's an older guy now, but he's been in the art world for a long time. He's just top of the heap when it comes to drawing. And a lot of his work has to do with these interiors. And so this is my favorite one of his. And he just develops this space. But, anybody can just get the perspective right. Once we learn the mechanics of that, it's not that big a deal. It might be hard and it might take a long time, but that's not really what drives the quality of this drawing. What drives the quality of the drawing is the value. The nuance and the subtlety that he works into the lights, and then as soon as we get to that chair rail on the wall, where below that everything is just that much darker, and the man that's walking through the room is sort of getting lost. I mean, he's firmly ground in the space, but his values are the same as the below the chair rail on the wall, and he just sort of comes and goes like a ghost. And I'm pretty sure that's what he's going for in this drawing. But Lopez Garcia, his drawings show you just the raw power of value all on its own, where he doesn't really need the kind of rendering details that most artists need. He seems to almost just skip right over that and just make purely organizational drawings. And there's so much suggestion of detail that he doesn't even really have to seem to think about it. Like in the next drawing, he's got these two plates, and I've always loved this image. It's just like he just finished eating whatever this was, and he's like, you know what? This is going to be an awesome drawing. And he just, draws the leftovers on his plate. And I think about this drawing the same way. It's like he's not drawing the objects. He's drawing the space that the objects are in, and he's drawing the light that makes the space work. And the details that come up are just part of the process. And the last Antonio Lopez Garcia piece is just this very sort of conventional portrait of this little girl. But the value relationships are huge and simple. And that's something I should have brought up already, is that when you want good, strong value, organizational value, your shapes need to be big and they need to be simple, especially if you're thinking about converting whatever it is that you're studying the value of. If you're thinking about converting that into color, it becomes a whole nother discussion. But value is going to be the fundamental building block of anything that you're going to do with color. So a picture like this, where the values are just so rich and so simple and so easy to read, converting this into a color scenario would just be wonderful. If you can get your values to be like this and then apply color, it's just, you've taken so many problems out of the equation that you're guaranteed to be successful. And it's just a really beautifully drawn drawing. My detail shot that I have, the quality of it's not great. So I wish I could have done better there, but hopefully you can see the richness and just the quality of the drawing in the coat. That's really the thing that has grabbed me from the beginning. Now the next artist is Maxfield Parrish, and he is known for his color. And so it's worth looking at his drawing work with an eye for what kind of a foundation he's building for his color later. In organizational shading, even though there's no color in it, it has everything to do with color. And I apologize for keep coming back to that. There's a whole nother discussion to be had there, and I haven't gotten to that quite yet. But if you're anxiously awaiting that topic, that is something that we'll be tackling in the future. But the cool thing about Maxfield Parrish's graphic work, his work only in value, is that almost all of them are also in color, because he would do black and white versions of illustrations, and then he would also do a color version that he knew he could sell as a painting. And when color printing became more prevalent and cost less, he would be commissioned to do more and more color illustrations. And so, and that really sort of had a big effect on his life and his career. So this first one, I don't have the information about the individual illustrations in front of me. For the life of me, I can't remember what book this is, but it's just an awesome image of this guy running through the forest with this giant, this absurdly huge gun. And it's just, you don't even need to know what the story is to be drawn in by the narrative that he's setting up. And just the sheer complexity of the space and the forest, you're overwhelmed by the thickness and the richness of it. And one of the things that we know about Maxfield Parrish is that he was a big fan of utilizing collage elements in the process of building images. So one of the things that he would do is he would have photographs of different elements that he would want to use. Like he would go out and he would photograph tree trunks. And then he would draw the tree trunks, and then he would cut them out, and then he would assemble them and make a collage out of what he was doing. And then he would make another complete drawing from the collage. And he did that with painting. He did it with a lot of different things. And it's really obvious that he did that here. The element of overlap is so strong in this picture. But the big values stay simple. And that's the reason I chose this drawing. It's got really deep darks, but if you squint at the picture, there's a vertical that runs right down the middle that encompasses the lights that are on the figure, the lights that run up the trees in the center, and then there's a transitional middle value that kind of runs around that, and then he places his big darks in strategic places up against the lightest light where he needs it, between the guy's legs where he needs it, and it just makes such a wonderful pace for the drawing, where it's lightning fast, it's super slow, it's just a masterpiece of a drawing. The next drawing by Maxfield Parrish is, for those of you who are enthusiasts for pen and ink, this is a drawing that was done entirely in that sort of stippling technique that takes forever. And to back up for a second, the last drawing was like a charcoal and ink wash drawing. So there's a lot of wet media in Maxfield Parrish's graphic work. But back to this one with this this Dutch guy. It's from the Knickerbocker's History of New York City, or maybe of Manhattan. But he had a series of just these weird historical little motifs that tell the little stories that made up the history of New York City. And this is just a great organizational drawing where, again, the details are not really important. The big values are what make the drawing work. And this guy that's like sitting on a tree branch in Central Park or whatever, it's really interesting that his head or his hat is jet black with no stipple dots in it at all. And then the stippling sort of emerges from the hat and then just sort of defines everything. And there's always a really heavy whiff of photography in Maxfield Parrish's work, because he was basically doing photorealism in the late 1800s, when about 100 years before photorealism really became a thing. But he used photos as reference. He didn't use the photographic process as part of the result. So that's what differentiates it from photorealism. This next drawing is just a terrific image and just another awesome example of what's possible when you have a good imagination and a mastery of value. The technical stuff here is really simple. The mist that he does here is just basically erasing. It looks like there's some watercolor, kind of ink wash starting out, but Maxfield Parrish, what he liked to do is do his ink on a really heavily textured paper, and then he liked to scrub charcoal over that to make little dots, and then he would go in with a pen and work up the dots a little more. And this is I believe that this is it's very grainy looking, and I believe that this is a mixture of all those techniques a little bit later in his illustration career. So he's not like isolating a single technique. It's really complex stuff. But just the way that he uses value to differentiate the huge giant pirate from this little kid, and just the whimsical sort of details that work their way through all of Maxfield Parrish's illustrations, where this little kid is swinging a sword like it's too heavy, the way a little kid would, and this just sort of fearlessness that gets conveyed by the drawing. It's just again, like Maxfield Parrish had so many masterpieces, you start to lose count, and on some level it isn't even really fair to the rest of us that he was as good as he was. The next drawing is another Maxfield Parrish piece where we're looking at a value scenario that is something I wanted to. I looked really hard to find good examples of this, and it's where you have your values in the foreground are where all your darks are, and you have basically the sort of foreground subject matter is in the dark, and then where you have your contrast and your lighter values are going to be further away in space. And there's a million ways to run this particular device, and it's a really great graphic device that you don't really see in European painting or drawing until around the 20th century. But late 19th century and early 20th century American illustrators were using this move all the time. And the Europeans picked it up later, but it's just a really, really strong graphic option that it's hard to find really great examples of in drawing. It tends to be a move that gets used a lot in painting, because when you foreground your darks and you're using color, you just have all these wonderful options for cool and dark colors, and a lot of color complexity and stuff in these darks in the foreground, and you can just have a ton of really interesting fun with that. But when you're drawing, it's in the dark. There's not that much you can do with it. So, but Maxfield Parrish just does a phenomenal job using that device here to just to play with the space and to create space that's just a little bit different. And that was one of the things that Parrish was always good for. The next drawing is a contemporary artist who's in New York named Michael Grimaldi. And I'm going to feature his drawings in some of the other discussions on shading, because he does everything right. But the drawings I wanted to focus on here are the strength of his organizational shading is through the roof, and it's just, he's so much better at it than almost anybody else I can think of, that I wanted to highlight him here, because while he's a perfectly good renderer and ridiculously good at that too, he places so much more priority on what his values are doing, where they're doing it, and why. so much more so than on his rendering that it just makes everything he does that much stronger. And this image here of this motorcycle kind of parked in the shade in a garage or in sort of an alley in Italy. I don't know. It sort of feels like maybe it's a drawing that has some sort of Italian references to it. But it's just, and I know that he works from life, and it just seems really surprising that a drawing like this, that's so atmospheric and so heavy, would be produced from life. It seems really unlikely to me that that's the case, but as far as I know, that's the kind of way he works, is that he works from life. But I just wanted to show you this drawing because it just does so many things right. And it doesn't rely on detail. It prioritizes what detail is important. And then the smaller details, they work their way in, but they're subjugated to the big shapes. And I think hopefully that's one of the lessons that we sort of get from the idea of organizational shading in the first place, is that it's not about how much detail you get into your drawing, it's about what detail is important. And when we move to Michael Grimaldi's next drawing, I kind of like this one because we use a lot of cast drawing in the program that I run at the University of South Alabama, and I like cast drawing. It's fun, and it's just really sort of nerdy, traditional thing to be doing. And Grimaldi here just turns cast drawing on its head. And cast drawing is like traditionally, it's what students would use to learn anatomy and to learn how to render form before they would move to a model. And so the tradition with cast drawing is this heavily modeled, heavily detailed, heavily rendered sort of thing. And Grimaldi comes along and he's like, no, that isn't even how you draw casts. Get out of the way and let me show you how it's done. And so he just produces this just blockbuster drawing where he sets up, in terms of like value organization, let me take you through this. So the value that's the lightest is at the bottom of the picture. And the darkest dark we run into immediately as soon as we get past, moving from bottom to top, as soon as we get past the lightest light, we're met with the darkest dark. So there's this really high contrast. As soon as we enter the picture from the bottom, we're presented with the first cast, who's in this very energetic sort of portrait kind of pose with lots of value contrast around her. She's got lighter lights. Her middle values aren't very dark, so there's lots of contrast. And then we move into these two bigger, more generalized poses with no arms, so there's not a lot of drama there, at least in terms of gesture. But all the contrast gets decreased. Notice as we go up the drawing, the shadows are lighter, but the lights are darker. It's like we're being dunked underwater as the space moves away from us. It's just this wonderful device for creating space. And like let's face it, we know that the casts in this scenario are white. They're shining white plaster, more than likely. They could be marble or something, and maybe they're not white marble. Maybe they're sort of a slight color. But we know that they're light. We know the walls are white. We see the reflection on the wall. These are all things that are really clear, but we're not being shown literally any of that. We're being shown this interpretation of the space, this design to play on your emotions and your point of view, and it's just pure pictorial power. And I'll have, when I get more of Grimaldi's drawings in other contexts, I'll have more to say, but that's enough on him for now. The next drawing is actually an etching by a really underrated and probably lesser known artist named Anders Zorn. He was a Norwegian artist, mostly known for his paintings, but his printmaking and his draftsman role in the late 19th century, early 20th century, he's just like second to none. There was like a triumvirate of painters at the time: Zorn, Sargent, and Soroya. And those are three artists that I like a lot, and I'll be talking about them when I get the opportunities. But the graphic work that Zorn puts forward is just really, really high level. And for those of you who are in my class who are interested in drawing in ink and developing a surface with pen, these are etchings, so it's not exactly the same thing, but you can largely get a lot of the same effects with just like a micron pen or a felt tip pen and a good piece of paper. But the way that the values in this drawing get worked up, it's actually very similar to the last drawing, the Michael Grimaldi drawing, where the contrast is all in the foreground, and then as we move back in space, the darks get lighter and the lights get darker, but we still understand everything. And in this one, the ground plane is there, but it's minimized by the desk and the sort of paper that he's writing on. But if you want an example of organizational shading that isn't just soft manipulation of charcoal or graphite, where there's a lot of really heavy mark making, very gritty kind of drawing, Zorn is an excellent example, but he also brings in this really crazy, like, rhythmic mark making that if you're going to work in pen, you really need to practice and get a handle on, because there's so much richness that happens there, just in terms of what line is capable of in and of itself when you start building up values with smaller marks and line work. So I have, to finish off the slideshow, I have a couple pieces by M.C. Escher. And these drawings don't really show off what Escher was all about. These are much more traditional, somewhat conventional, albeit weird drawings. They're not the impossible structures and Fibonacci sequences and things that we kind of associate with him. So Escher is a topic that could probably be handled sort of all on its own, but I wanted to include a couple of these drawings because he's just one of the best draftsmen of all time. And this really weird self-portrait looking through this like round window, I don't know what to make of this drawing. It's probably the drawing that I've shown in the slideshow that's the most heavily reliant on detail. And perhaps it's more of a drawing that we would use for a discussion on rendering. But the values are so beautifully organized. I mean, he isolates his face using this circle, and then, don't make the mistake of thinking that this is a round drawing. The black part around the circle is totally part of the drawing. And he uses it to isolate the part of his face that he wants to emphasize, and then just gives us, inside that circle, just gives us this really complex series of surfaces and values, but it's hard to describe with words, and maybe I shouldn't even have to because it's right in front of us, but the thing you want to be shooting for is you want something that's both simple and complex at the same time. And in this drawing, the values are super simple, and that's what holds the complexity of the drawing up. But the word that keeps coming to mind, And the words that keep coming to mind as I'm trying to discuss it are words like complexity and richness, and things that imply lots of different things going on all at once, and there are. But if one thing needs to be simple, it always needs to be value. And then once you get there, you're free to be complex about everything else. And that's ultimately one of the big lessons that I wanted to get out about organizational shading. And this last drawing that we have by Escher is just another flawless example of that, where you can kind of see that it's a still life and that he really wants to highlight these individual objects. But his first priority is to organize the values and the placement of the objects in a way that can showcase them. And then as he develops the drawing, really all he ends up doing is developing the values from big to small. And by the time he gets to small, the drawing has drawn the details for him. And there's very little left for him to do in terms of rendering. So if you're someone who feels like you don't really understand detail, just take the organizational aspects of drawing seriously, and you'll get so far. And people will think your drawings are detailed when you haven't even really started thinking about it. And that's something that we'll find when we discuss planes in a little bit more detail. You'll find that that's the case there too. And I think that planes have a place in the discussion more in the realm of rendering, but they're definitely playing a role in the organizational aspect of drawing as well. But that's enough of the discussion for now. I think I've rounded out the discussion and came to a pretty good conclusion. So that's going to be it for now.